Good day, everyone. Welcome to my lecture entitled Targeting Postcolonial Subjectivity, Philippinization and the Problems of Nationalist Transgression for today's PHAVISMINDA World Philosophy Day. For those who claim and believe that there exists a Filipino philosophy, whether taken as a distinct, unique worldview present in a Filipino people, or as a term to collectively refer to a more or less coherent set of beliefs that aim to unify or eventually construct a people, the challenge to be relevant in these pandemic times has clearly shown itself wanting. For one, its messianic tendency to solve the current problems of Philippine society, as Renato Constantino would have it way back in 1978, has remained impotent in the face of the current whiplash of the dramatic and farcical handling of the way electoral substitutions have been handled by traditional politicians or trapos, such as the Aguila of the South and the northern son of who is possibly the worst robber in the history of the Guinness Book of World Records. From another angle, it is a continuing task of philosophers in the Philippines today to continue finding the relevance precisely as Filipino citizens intent at making the philosophical act itself as relevant. This latter act of Filipinizing the philosophic activity itself, however, is beset with a lot of theoretical problems that seriously need an honest assessment. If philosophy in the Philippines today is to be relevant, and Filipino philosophers, which I use here under erasure, should still have jobs, then we should still continue to consider the conditions for the possibility of a distinct Filipino way of philosophizing as a worthwhile academic endeavor. So here, the practice of writing under erasure reveals at the outset that this study works within the tension created between the insecurity of a constructed we as a starting point of discourse and the impossibility of doing away with the concepts that we have inherited from traditional history. Speaking from the vantage point of the present, this study makes a conscious attempt to put we under erasure as a recognition of the precarious and undefined limitations inherent in the anachronistic and naive employment of historical categories by traditional nationalist thinking. In responding to this conference theme, namely subjectivity and post-coloniality, the challenges of contemporary Filipino identity, I advance the claim that the most subtle challenge confronting contemporary Filipino identity is its unacknowledged complicity with the neo-colonial thinking that a nationalist perspective necessarily equates to an anti-colonial and henceforth emancipatory enterprise. On the contrary, the construction of Filipino identity as a supposedly post-colonial subjectivity amounts to a theoretical solidification that masks the epistemic violence of nationalist thinking upon those whom it claims to represent and therefore emancipate. In order to illustrate my thesis, I will directly go into the problems connected with post-colonial thinking as articulated by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak in an interview where she rebukes Robert Young's understanding of post-colonialism by claiming it as totally bogus. For Spivak, neocolonialism is not simply the continuation of colonialism. It is a different thing, and that is what she calls as post-coloniality. She further continues that neocolonialism is simply displaced colonialism because you need a different kind of policy when it is territorial imperialism, being in loco parentis to the natives, etc. It is no longer imperative, but neocolonialism in general has as its alibi a fully fledged cultural relativism. In this very specific context, what am I trying to suggest is a very careful practice of Filipinization when it comes to interpreting history and the rich cultural legacy of what is loosely termed as the indigenous because the term post-colonial does not automatically equate to what is anti-colonial. In fact, as I had hoped to show in my past lectures, Philippinization itself is in fact, or actually, the most colonial of all epistemic projects because it masks itself as anti-colonial under the banner of Filipino nationalism. This leads to the fetishization of nationalism as an emancipatory enterprise intent at the abolition of colonial rule, in this case Spanish and American, and domination. Yet a closer examination of its concepts and strategies would reveal that the persistent Filipinization of history and the struggles of the poor and native Indio majority has only yielded an epistemic transgression of these same struggles as excluded by the Filipino Ilustrados from their imagined national community. To cite only a case in point, Emilio Aguinaldo has labeled the millenarian struggles of the peasants of Central Luzon, such as those of Teodoro Pansacula and Felipe Salvador, as banditry and insurrection against his revolutionary government when this group of peasants realized that the nationalist elites who shaped the Philippine Revolution of 1896 did not really intend to pursue a policy of social, land, and taxation reforms. Nationalism in this very specific scenario was not only a construction of the elite, it was also an anachronism used to interpret the other struggles of those peasants that were also fighting their own anti-colonial struggles. This ideological and class divide must be carefully considered by any thinker who claims that nationalist unity is the ultimate solution to the problems that ill this country. Especially in this pandemic cum election times, the critical task of making distinctions between conflicting class with ethno-religious interests must be clearly brought out at the forefront of current philosophical discourse. In the light of the above, how then should we think of the Philippinization of critique instead of the task of philosophical thinking itself, or more insightfully of a Filipino post-colonial subjectivity? First, if the task of critique is really to emancipate the poor and the native majority, even the indigenous, from the relics of colonial oppression, then those who Philippinize thinking or philosophy must be able to address how the problems of marginalizing exclusion and violent inclusion occasioned by the Ilustrado nationalist thinking of Jose Rizal and his cohorts. Filipino nationalism in the mode of Rizal has always been paradoxical in its arbitrary act of othering the natives, that is the poor, peasant, Indian majority, and the mountain tribes, through their exclusive patrimony over the Filipino nation. This can be gleaned in the way Rizal's Enlightenment discourse about Filipino equality was also utilized at the same time as the very same basis by which the Ilustrados can pronounce their superiority over those native Indios who either resisted Spanish colonial rule and refused evangelization or did not encounter Spanish civilization and accepted the Catholic religion. By conflating race with the capacity for culture, Rizal had utilized racial theory to lay down the condition and demonstrate the possibility for legal equality with the elite peninsular class. But in doing so, he restricted civilization and Hispanization only to those Indios who belong to the pure Malay race. Rizal's nativist exclusivism amounted to an elitism which effectively created a spurious distinction between a carefully defined racial inside that must be set out against those non-Hispanized and non-Christian tribes outside the sphere of Spanish colonial hegemony. Secondly, thinkers of Philippinization must always take into account that any attempt at an ideological identification of something that resembles a sort of Filipinoness or Filippinicity that can unite all inhabitants of the Philippines into one homogeneous anti-colonial people, even if only as citizens or legally, must subsequently engage itself in a performative contradiction. This is because the very notion of Filipinas itself and of the Filipino are themselves inescapably products of colonization itself. So for my conclusion, given the above insights, the ideological origins of the modern Philippine nation, what then can we conclude about the messianic or salvific character of Philippinization, taken here as the persistent desire to Philippinize or to interpret everything in the past as part of the linear history of a Filipino people? And so we ask, is there anything messianic about Philippinization? While this paper cannot claim comprehensiveness due to the limits of time, the attempted reconstruction of history with respect to the narrative of emancipation, as conducted by the nationalism of Jose Rizal and his fellow Ilustrados, and its attendant influence on all subsequent nationalisms as documented within Philippine historiography, has yielded several insights into the subtle contradictions of Filipino nationalist thinking itself. First, Philippinization is an identity discourse oriented towards a very specific political aim, that is to secure legal equality with the Spanish peninsulars in the eyes of Spanish law. And since this identity was only initially applicable to a select class, it was therefore clear from the outset that they had a very parochial view of emancipation, such that it excludes those who cannot achieve its lofty ideals of Hispanicity and Catholicity. Second, consequent to their very parochial view of Filipino identity, the Ilustrados viewed Las Islas Filipinas as their exclusive patrimony. This implies that the nation was not meant to be shared by all the inhabitants of a geographic Filipinas, while its attendant attribute of sovereignty was designed to benefit only those who belong to the nation. And third, by sharing in the powers of the colonial masters, it must be stressed that the Ilustrados were not working for independence. Ilustrado nationalism was not intent at achieving emancipation from the Spanish colonizers, but on the contrary, were primarily intent at the preserving of the colonial structures of oppression and domination. On this account, Philippinization, taken as a differential construction of Filipino identity, would precisely accomplish that discursive complicity which renders it as the precise translation of Spanish colonialism into the homohegemony of Filipino nationalism. Given the above contradictions, we can say then that the nation as an emancipatory principle failed to live up to its promise as a principle for radical change. Instead, it has become an instrument by which the elite and the Ilustrado class were able to hold their control over the economic and political life of the nation. By a sweeping generalization, the nationalist thinking that we trace from Padre Burgos to Rizal and the Ilustrados and subsequently taken by revolutionary ideology was what precisely accomplished the drama by which Spanish colonialism and its oppressive structures were historically repeated. Milagros Guerrero's incisive advice was brilliantly prophetic in its anachronism. And I end this paper with a quote from her. The drama of the past must not be played out in the future. But what if the narrative with the same features, though seemingly according to a master plot, continues into the present? And why so? From Luzon Atuar, page 12. Thank you very much for listening and good day.